Welcome to our first discussion on life in medieval Europe. The collapse of the Roman Empire led to the Middle Ages in Western Europe from about 500 CE to 1500 CE. So we call this time period starting at the collapse of the Roman Empire to the Renaissance as the Middle Ages. Some historians refer to this also as the Dark Ages. The feudal system is a political system based on loyalty and protection that developed as a result of constant invasions in Western Europe. Some of these invasions included the Germanic people, as discussed in a previous video, but also you had invasions from the Vikings in the north and Muslims from the south. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, there was a need for order and protection due to a lack of central government. And because of this lack of central government, out of that developed the feudal system in Western Europe. So what was the feudal system? This is the societal hierarchy that developed in Western Europe under feudalism. At the top of the hierarchy was the monarch, the king. And so this system of feudalism is based on receiving something and giving. Okay. And so the monarch would give land, or fief, as it's known, and order. A fief is a large plot of land, and not only the land was included, but if there was a river, there was a forest, the animals, sometimes a whole village was included on the fief. So the monarch gave land and order, which was needed during this time of chaos, to the lords, or the nobles and church officials. The nobles and church officials gave land, a fief, to the knights. The knights gave land, a small chunk of land, and provided protection to the peasants and serfs. Again, you can tell the theme that feudalism is a political system based on loyalty and protection due to a lack of central government. This kind of disorder. It's providing order when there is disorder. And so if you look, right, they're receiving something, but they're also giving something in return. And so the peasants and serfs give are the ones responsible for supplying the food and providing services to the knights. In return, the knights provide loyalty and protection to the lords. And the lords, the nobles and the church officials, give loyalty, money, and knights to the monarch to defend his kingdom. And so this hierarchy is the feudal system. So let's talk about how feudalism worked. A little bit more detail. How was someone's social class determined in the feudal system? Simply put, you were born into your social class. If you were a noble, if your parents were a noble, you also were noble. If your parents were serfs, then you are also born into being a serf. So at the top of the hierarchy was the monarch, the king, our queen. The responsibilities of the monarch was to keep order and provide protection to their vassals. Here's a vocabulary word, vassal. A vassal is someone who is inferior in this social structure. So everyone technically was a vassal to the monarch. Everyone was inferior to the monarch. So the monarch's main responsibility was to keep order and provide protection to the vassals within his kingdom. The monarch gained their power through divine right, or in other terms, they were chosen by God. And so here were some of the kingdoms in Europe during the Middle Ages. And these kingdoms would change. They weren't always consistent in terms of boundaries and who's in charge. As we move down the hierarchy, underneath the monarch was the lords. And these were nobles and church officials. In a later video, we will talk about the church itself and how it remained powerful throughout medieval Europe. So the lords were the nobles and the church officials. The responsibilities for the nobles, they managed and defended his property and the people that worked on it. So it was his responsibility to protect his land and the people that lived on that land, which could be hundreds of people. The nobles appointed officials to make sure that villagers fulfilled their duties. Right, so they appointed officials to make sure the peasants, the serfs, the knights, everybody was doing their part on their land, or what is called the manor. The nobles also acted as judges on the manors. They had the power to fine and punish those who committed what was deemed a crime. The responsibilities of the noble women. They oversaw the household, which could have hundreds of people working in it. They also could hold fiefs and inherit land when their husband is away or died. As we're moving down the hierarchy, we have the knights. And the knights needed to be somewhat wealthy to be able to afford the expensive suit of armor and the horses that were required to be a knight. The responsibilities of knights included providing protection to really all other members of the social hierarchy. There were 3 basic stages for a boy to become a knight. The first step was they were a page. A page was a servant boy learning and during this time they learned how to ride horses and they received religious instruction. From the age of 7 to 14, these boys were pages. It's important they received religious instruction. The Christianity played a large part in knighthood. The second stage was the boy would become a squire, an assistant to the knight, where they really took time and trained to be a warrior. That was between the ages of 14 and their early 20s. When they reached their early 20s and they were approved, they would become a knight, and they would participate in a complex religious event where they were knighted. Being a knight was a way of life. And what I mean by that is knights had to follow a code of chivalry, which was a code of behavior that included to follow the church, to serve and defend the noble, to help widows and orphans, to protect women and the weak, and to be generous and honest. Like I said, being a knight wasn't just an occupation, it was a way of life, and they had to follow the code of chivalry. Knights also trained by fighting one another in tournaments that had spectators. There was these competitions they would participate in as a method of training. We see the use of knights end in the 17th century due to the use of gunpowder and cannons, also the crossbow. These new weapons of choice made the idea of knights obsolete, which we'll talk more about in a future video. And at the bottom of the social hierarchy that was created under the feudal system were peasants. Peasants made up the majority of the population. If you take the population of peasants and serfs, in most places it was roughly 90%. 90% of the population was peasants and serfs. So the majority of the population. The responsibility of the peasants and serfs was to work the land, so to farm. But they also provided services. They were blacksmiths, weavers, other types of artisans. All right, so the responsibilities of the peasants and serfs was to work the land and provide services. In return for doing this, in exchange for working the land and providing these services, they were given a small plot of land to farm. And they were also given protection, which was important during this time of kind of chaos and disorder. So what's the difference between a free peasant and a serf? A free peasant, they rented the land. They could come and go as they pleased from the manor. Where a serf was bound to the land. They could not own property. They could not move to another area, and they could not marry without the noble's permission. So there was strict limitations that serfs had, and they were bound to the land. They could not leave that land. Now they were not slaves, so don't give into that misconception. Serfs were not slaves. They couldn't be sold away from the manor like we see enslaved people go through later on in history. But serfs, again, free peasants rented the land. They could come and go as they pleased. Serfs were bound to the land. And there were much more restrictions on them. They needed to pay taxes. So peasants and serfs had to pay a number of taxes to the lord of the land. And they paid a head tax, which was a yearly tax. They paid a tallage tax, was a tax whenever the lord needed some extra money. A tithe, which is 1/10 of their income to the church. A marriage tax, and a grain tax. So the peasants and serfs paid, not only did they supply a certain amount of, crops or goods to their lord, but they also paid taxes to the lord, but also to the church. And you might be thinking, why did the peasants, but more specifically the serfs, those who were bound to the land, those who were really restricted in life, why did they accept their position in society? Why did they accept their position in this social hierarchy where they are at the bottom? Well, it's simply because it was part of the church's teachings. And Western Europe at this time was Christian. More specifically, they were part of the Roman Catholic Church. And part of the church's teachings is to accept the fact that God determined one's place in society. And if you changed or you challenged your status, you were going directly against God. So people accepted where they were because they believed that's where God placed them, and they didn't want to challenge God. And they believed that if you accept your position and you work a hard life and you don't challenge God, that he will provide salvation to good Christians and you will have a good afterlife in heaven if you just accept where you are at in life today. So that's a basic overview of the feudal system in Europe and how the social hierarchy was, developed due to a lack of a central government, and the disorder and kind of chaos that was caused by that, and the constant fear from invasion. The last point I want to make is here's a peasant's wheel of life, how they had special jobs to do each month. They were never given off time. When it was winter and they couldn't grow crops, or there were certain crops they couldn't grow, they had other tasks to do on the manor. Okay. The next video will be all about the manor and that economic system that developed in Western Europe.